Okay, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Keiko Ito. I'll be chairing this session. So this session focuses on the heterogeneous impacts of supply chain shocks across firms and products, which is highly relevant for designing well-targeted and finely tuned policy responses. So today we have two excellent presentations, and followed by a discussion and Q&A. So each presenter will have 20 minutes. Okay, so let me now introduce our first speaker, Dr. Takafumi Kawakubo from Osaka University. So Dr. Kawakubo received his PhD in economics from the London School of Economics, and he is currently an assistant professor at the Graduate School of International Public Policy, Osaka University. He's also a fellow at RIETI and a research associate at the University of Tokyo. So he has been very actively working on many research projects focusing on international trade, global supply chains, and firm behavior and applied microeconomics, with particular emphasis on the resilience and vulnerability of supply chains. Okay, so Dr. Kawakubo's today's presentation is entitled Economic Security, Supply Chain Vulnerabilities, and Industrial Policy. So Dr. Kawakubo, the floor is yours.
Okay, so thank you for having me today in this great symposium. My name is Takafumi Kawakubo from University of Osaka and RIETI. Today I'm going to explain recent economic studies on supply chain vulnerabilities using very granular microdata sets and potential implications for promoting economic security. So in the past 6 years or so, supply chains have suffered major disruptions such as Brexit, COVID-19 pandemic, natural disasters, trade wars, and the war in Ukraine. It is expected that these disruptions are likely to happen more in the future due to climate change and geopolitical reasons. At the same time, economic security is a central issue in the recent policy making. For example, the Japanese government is currently working on the revision of the Economic Security Promotion Act. So these two figures show how people are getting more concerned about supply chains. So the left figure comes from Google Trend, which basically counts how many times people search by supply chains. So from January 2015 to July 2025, there is a clear upward trend, implying that people are getting more and more concerned about supply chains in a negative sense because of supply chain disruptions, risks, and uncertainty surrounding it. The right figure comes from a recent paper by Fernandez Villaverde and his co-authors. They constructed an index called Geopolitical Fragmentation Index. So from mid-2000s to now, there is a sharp increase in the geopolitical fragmentation because of lots of bad events. So these two figures show how people are getting more concerned about supply chain disruptions or vulnerabilities. And in order to know what's underlying these sort of vulnerabilities, what could be the impacts of these supply chain vulnerabilities, or how we can resolve these supply chain vulnerabilities, we actually need very granular microdata sets. So these granular microdata sets are getting more and more available these days. So let me talk a little bit on this. On one hand, we have so-called administrative data. The detailed information is collected for administrative purposes, and we can utilize that kind of very detailed information to study supply chain stuff. For example, customs data records international transactions, so we can see what kind of input is coming from or what kind of output is going to which country. Okay? So this VAT data, value-added tax administrative data, records domestic transactions, so we can observe domestic firm-to-firm linkages. So some countries have allowed researchers to work on these very detailed customs or VAT data. For example, Japanese customs data can be recently it can be accessed through the Ministry of Finance. So they started a very good initiative. On the other hand, there are also data sets called proprietary data provided by private companies. For example, in Japan, we have Tokyo Shock Research, or TDB, and TSR, for example, has a very granular detailed information on domestic buyer-supplier linkages. And AIS data is the data which tracks the movement of ships. So we can see where a ship is coming from or where the ship is going to. So this left figure is a kind of satellite image of ships. So you can kind of have a big amount of information from this AIS data. There's also another kind of information called a bill of lading data, which could potentially supplement the customs data. So all in all, these very granular microdata sets have very detailed information at the firm level or even more granular firm-to-firm transaction level. So we can use these data sets to tackle the supply chain vulnerabilities. For example, by using the customs data, so this right figure is a kind of picture of the network structure between Norwegian exporters and US importers. So we can look into this kind of network structure by using customs data. So in the second part of my talk, I'd like to talk about recent economic studies on supply chains. Today, I talk about 3 types of supply chain disruptions coming from nature-driven disasters, trade wars, and then conflicts. So the key questions are, what will be the impacts of these supply chain vulnerabilities or disruptions, both direct and indirect ones, and how could firms mitigate these disruptions when they face major supply shocks? So let me start from the nature-driven disasters. There are a couple of papers that studied Great East Japan earthquake in March 2011. For example, a paper by Professor Todo is working on this Great Japan earthquake, and I have a paper with my co-author Suzuki-san in 2024. There is also a group of papers that looked into the impact of major floods, one of the most phenomenal natural disaster. For example, the Claire Barboni at LSE has a recent paper in 2025, and this right top figure comes from Barboni et al. 2025. They focus on Pakistani floods that have very large scale, and also they explored Pakistani VAT data, so value-added tax administrator data, to examine the impact of these major floods on domestic Pakistani firm-to-firm transactions. There's also some papers looked at the impact of COVID-19 pandemic. For example, Gaurav Khanna and his co-authors work on this, focusing on Indian lockdown policies. So this right bottom figure comes from Khanna et al. 2022, looking at district level variation in lockdown policies. So these red zones, red areas have the most stringent lockdown policy, and the green areas have the least stringent lockdown policies. So the different levels of stringency could result in different magnitudes of disruptions in firm-to-firm transactions. By exploiting these district level variation, they study the impact of these lockdown policies on Indian firm-to-firm transactions. So that's what they did in the paper. So let me spend a bit of time to explain what I did with my co-author Suzuki-san in the 2024 paper. Okay? So as you can imagine, earthquake is very much of an unexpected and localized shock. So for example, these 2 figures show the spatial distribution of fatalities and missings on the left-hand side, and also demand structure on the right-hand side. As you can see, the damage was kind of very large, but at the same time, the damage was concentrated in the eastern part of the Tohoku region. For example, the firms in Tokyo or firms in Osaka did not have direct damage by the earthquake. But as you can imagine, there could be indirect impacts on those firms through the supply chains. So we focus on firms located outside of this area and aim to study the so-called propagation effect through the supply chains. So firstly, surprisingly, on average, we find that treated firms avoided the damage by quickly switching to new and alternative suppliers. They were actually not differentially hurt by the earthquake. But this kind of average effect masks a significant heterogeneity. So we conducted additional heterogeneity analysis, and what we focus on is the duration of relationships. We think duration of relationships could be an important proxy for product specificity or the reliance on suppliers. If you have a long-term relationship with a specific supplier, which could imply that you are very much dependent on that specific suppliers. For example, you're sourcing some fine-tuned product, and so that's why this is a very important dimension. So having that in mind, we divided the sample into those buyer firms with long-term relationship and buyer firms with short-term relationship. And what we find is that buyers in long-term relationships actually had significant sales losses and struggled to replace their old suppliers. So these results in our paper with Suzuki-san actually highlight the importance of swift adjustment of supply chains. So as far as you can quickly switch to alternative ones, or you can find alternative ones very in a swift manner, then you would be not really damaged by a major supply shock. This kind of finding is very much in line with other recent supply chain studies in economics. For example, Barboni et al. Focusing on Pakistani floods, or Khanna's paper, Khanna et al. Focusing on Indian lockdown policy, or a simulation exercise by Todo Sensei and Inoue Sensei. So the policy implication here is that government should support firms to quickly match with alternative suppliers. So let me move on to the second type of supply chain disruptions coming from trade wars. So in this sense, it's really nice to have our discussant Dr. BOWN, because he has a very important contribution to this field. In his 2007 paper, they looked into 30-country effects of tariffs, and they categorized trade deflection and trade depreciation. There's a group of papers that have examined Trump tariffs 1.1, so the tariffs conducted in the first Trump administration, including Fujikawa et al. 2024 and others. Today, I'd like to talk a little bit about a recent paper by Professor Sawada at University of Tokyo. So these figures are taken from Sawada et al. 2025. What they focus on is Vietnam. So they looked at the 30-country effects on Vietnam, and by using Vietnamese customs data and production data, they find there is a sharp increase in Vietnam's exports to the United States and sharp increase in Vietnam's imports from China after the US-China decoupling or the trade war. So this is a very kind of clear and sensible result. And on top of that, they conducted kind of additional analysis, and they looked into the spatial distribution of the trade shock, as the rightmost figure suggests. The third type of disruption comes from conflicts. So there is a very important paper, recent paper by Kolovkin et al. 2025, focusing on Russia-Ukraine conflict in 2014. What they did is to use railway shipment data from Ukraine. So, this figure suggests the railway network in Ukraine, and the black areas are the conflict zones. And they examined the impact of these conflicts on Ukrainian domestic shipments. So they found a very big impact. There is also another group of imported papers looked at the reduction in Russian gas exports to Germany. So in that sense, it's really nice to have Professor Müller today, and I think he's going to talk about his paper. But on top of that, I'd like to mention a very important paper by Professor Ben Moore at LSE in 2023. And I also been working on future attack stuff. Okay, so the Ben Moore et al. 2023, the title of their paper is The Power of Substitution. So the context is this: so Russia weaponized its gas exports to Germany in 2022. So people expected that it could result in a huge damage on German economy. But the authors find that Germany was actually able to replace Russian gas imports and with imports from third countries, so they could sort of avoid the damage. They conduct additional simulation exercises and find that supply shocks have much smaller costs if elasticity of substitution are very low compared to a zero elasticity. So elasticity substitution is a very key important parameter in economics, measuring how easy you can substitute an input with something else. So this right figure comes from their simulation exercise. On the x-axis, they have the natural gas, supply of natural gas. On the y-axis, they have production. This blue dotted line shows the case where sigma equal to 0. So elasticity substitution equal to 0, meaning that you cannot really substitute a Russian natural gas with something else. So as you can see, it results in a very huge damage on German production. This purple solid line is a case where sigma equal to 1, meaning that you can perfectly substitute Russian gas with something else. So you can, as you can see, there is barely any impact on German economy. So interesting cases come from these yellow ones and red ones. So even if sigma equal to 0.1, meaning very low elasticity, there is not much damage on German economy. So when sigma equal to 0.05, it's still very low elasticity, but there comes some sort of damage, but still much better compared to the zero elasticity case. So the key message here is that as far as you can substitute existing input with something else, you can avoid the damage, you can mitigate the damage in a very good way. Okay? So this is very much consistent with what I explained in the first supply chain disruption about nature-driven disasters. So let me talk a bit of time, take a bit of time about this ongoing research. So we have been using the AIS data, so it's really nice to see the article about the shipping route in this Japan news. But the context is that Japan relies on maritime logistics for more than 99% of its imports of food, energy, and materials. But recently, geopolitical risks disrupt maritime logistics. The event includes such as the Houthi attacks on ships in Red Sea, as this FT article suggests. So AIS data tracks ship movements. So by using AIS data, we can look into this kind of topics and study maritime supply chain logistics. So these two maps show the vessel routes in different timings. The left one shows the 1-year window before December 2023, and the right figure shows the 1-year window after December 2023, after the incidents of the Houthi attacks. So as you can see, there is a kind of striking change in vessel routes. So there used to be ships going through the Red Sea, but then after this incident, they chose not to use the Red Sea, but rather going around the Cape of Good Hope. And our calculation suggests that it resulted in a 50% increase in energy costs and CO2 emissions. So it has very much high costs on everyone. It could be passed on through to producer costs or consumer prices, so it's very meaningful. So in the last couple of minutes, let me talk about the future perspectives. As Chairman Fukawa mentioned in the opening remark, there is a plan to establish a comprehensive think tank about economic security, or the Center for Economic Security. I think this is a very important step forward for the Japanese government to commit to economic security issues, because the situation is very much uncertain, unstable, and complicated. So it requires in-depth analysis using very granular data. So research skills, research tools, research ability by people in academia could totally contribute to this field, and I think it's very important. So for this, I think it's essential for the government to pull the relevant data sets in normal times, update these data sets regularly or timely, and also prepare for sudden policy needs or emergency, as Professor Fukawa mentioned in the opening remark about 2 pillars. Okay? So in the beginning, I talked about availability of granular data, but actually there is much of the necessity of granular data. For example, international transactions can be observed from very detailed customs data, bill of lading data, or AIS data. Domestic transactions can be studied by using TSR data, or these sort of proprietary data, and also the VAT data, value-added tax data. So by combining these, we can actually study the global supply chain in a very detailed way, and also we can think about, tackle factors underlying vulnerabilities for global supply chains. So I think it is really nice if the center secures continuous data access for researchers who address key policy questions. For example, UK Data Service has the 5 SAFEs framework, so it could be an important framework that we can follow. But I think it's very important for researchers to be involved in this kind of economic security center to push the frontier forward. I think in doing so, RIETI plays a key role since it has conducted both academic and policy works using microdata sets, and also it has strong ties with relevant institutions such as METI and JOGMEC-IDE-JETRO. So thank you very much. This is the end of the presentation.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kawakubo. Thank you very much for providing extensive review of studies on supply chain shocks. So now let us move on to the next speaker, Dr. Steffen Müller from the Halle Institute for Economic Research. So Professor Müller is the head of the Department of Structural Change and Productivity at the Halle Institute for Economic Research, one of Germany's leading economic research institute. He also holds a position as Professor of Economics at the Otto von Guericke University. And Professor Müller's research focuses on firm productivity, labor markets, and structural change, with a strong emphasis on empirical analysis and policy relevance. Okay, so Dr. Müller's today's presentation is entitled Rapid Assessment of Economic Vulnerability Using Firm Product Level Data. So Professor Müller, the floor is yours.
So thank you very much for the kind invitation and for putting this together. Thank you for the nice introduction. And also thanks to my previous speaker for highlighting the high degree of flexibility that the many private actors and firms actually have, which is something I think we should keep in mind when talking about a strong role of the government. I will talk today about a specific policy project that I undertook after the Russian invasion of Ukraine. This is the case of the German manufacturing sector and gas shortage. So as you know, natural gas is a very important input for many things. So you need it in power plants to generate electricity. You need it to heat private homes. And it's also a key input in many manufacturing sectors. And after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, Germany finally realized how dependent it was from Russian gas, particularly cheap pipeline gas. So about 50% of the German imports of gas originate in Russia. And this created, of course, the potential for blackmailing the German government, which, of course, heavily opposed the invasion of Ukraine, but felt a huge degree of uncertainty about the economic vulnerability of the country. And just a quote here, or not a quote, but I mention what the chemical industry lobby, for instance, put into leading newspapers directly after the invasion. They said, if Russia stops the gas exporting to Germany, then the German chemical industry would immediately collapse, which would then cause widespread manufacturing collapse, because basic chemicals are a key ingredient for many downstream sectors. So they make a value chain argument. Well, it was very difficult for the German government to kind of verify those claims. And the perceived economic vulnerability of Germany was for sure one reason for the very hesitant support of the Ukraine at the beginning, where we did not send any weapons, we sent helmets. So why have the economic consequences of a sudden gas stop be unclear? I would like to highlight two dimensions here. The first one is an analytical dimension or limitation. So what we had very quickly after the invasion were results from macroeconomic general equilibrium models, which are, of course, by nature of a model simplifying, that's okay, but they're also quite aggregated, and they heavily rely on some assumptions on the necessity of substitution between energy inputs. They mainly neglected, I think, other dimension of substitutabilities. And when talking about the elasticity of substitution between different energy carriers, it's also very important to think about the time dimension. So in the long run, elasticity will be high. In the short run, it might be very low. And those models also had difficulties in kind of modeling any cascade effects down the value chain. The result of this type of uncertainty was a wide range of loss estimates. And of course, the government, had a hard time learning from those estimates how big the loss would be. So some studies estimate a 0.5% loss, maybe up to 3%. Bachmann et al., I think this is the same group as Moll et al., but they changed maybe the ordering of the authors, so this was a very influential paper. But others, so a union finance paper, for instance, assumed a Leontief production function with zero necessity of substitution, both between energy carriers and also along the value chain, and quickly we have a 12% GDP loss, which is, of course, dramatic. The second limitation concerns data. So Germany still has only input-output tables at the two-digit sector level, which is far too coarse to kind of assess any downstream effects or cascade effects. And the government was not aware of any ready-to-use microdata on gas usage. So in this situation, I called the ministry and said, look, colleagues, I'm currently working on an academic project using data that might be of use for you. So it was really dependent on individual researchers contacted the ministry, and this resulted in a couple of unpublished reports for the government that I can also not fully report on today, and also an expertise for the German Council of Economic Experts. So what did we do? We merged two microdata sets from the German Statistical Office. These two data sets cover all establishments in manufacturing that have at least 20 employees. The first one, and that's important, is a product level data. So I'm trying to get the message across that product level data can be very helpful. And this product level data is very fine-grained. It's a 9-digit level in Germany. Actually, I also have a 10-digit. It's not very informative, however. And this data set also includes physical output, so how many kilograms or tons of whatever you produce, and also the production values. So let's call it sales. And a second data set that we merged to it is a survey on energy input data by energy carrier. So we know how much kilowatt hours are used for the production of a certain product if we merge these two data sets. And you could think of these type of surveys also when you think about critical minerals, by the way. So in Germany we have it for energy, but maybe it's also worth thinking about collecting or having any such surveys that then could be merged with other microdata that might already be available in your country. So after merging these two data sets, you have a product level data set on gas consumption and sales for the manufacturing sector. And this at first allows you to, for instance, see what are the most gas-heavy products. So what are the products that use the most of your gas? And second, having sales, you also know what are the products with the highest gas intensity, meaning energy input per euro sales. So this is nice to start with. Because you could come up with some estimates for a direct GDP loss if you assume, say, we stop producing the 25% products with the highest gas consumption, which is a nice, maybe interesting number. Unfortunately, this would, of course, not help you in assessing any potential downstream effects across the value chain. And gas is used typically at very upstream. So there are a lot of downstream sectors for which you could lose value added. So what could be the solution to this? So our solution was to assess whether gas-intensive products, so the stuff that you produce from gas, could be imported instead of produced domestically. So we have not been thinking about energy input substitution, but we have been thinking about substituting the upstream products, basic chemicals, for instance, with imports. And to do this, you can merge a third data set, so that many of you, I guess, are familiar with the UN Comtrade data on trade flows, which is also at the product level. So after integrating the data, So the Comtrade data with the German product level data, you have a data set at the product level. Here it's only 6-digit product level because Comtrade is only at a 6-digit. That includes global bilateral trade flows, including, by the way, also Germany's exports of gas-heavy products that you might consider maybe stopping temporarily. Then German gas consumption by product, and German production values by product. And this then helps you to additionally understand, first of all, which gas-intensive products are actually tradable. So there might be reasons why some products cannot be traded. You could assess, and I will show you in a minute how we do that, whether import substitution is likely to be expensive or not. You could exclude risky import sources, like in this case Russia, and also other European countries because they also had no gas, or little. And you could look at your exports of gas-intensive products. All right. So let's get started with some basic facts on the pre-22 gas consumption in the German manufacturing sector, which was about 350 terawatt hours of gas per year. And if you just zoom into the 300 most gas-heavy products out of 1,600, you see that 90% of the 89% of the gas consumption is concentrated within these 300 products. And if you zoom in further, you see that distribution is still heavily skewed within those 300 products. And this graph shows you that, for instance, the top 16 products in terms of gas consumption, terawatt hours, consume 25% of the gas. So if you start from the left upper corner here and go downwards, you see just 16 products account for 25% of gas consumption, which means as a government body, you can really look into what are these products, what are the production processes, how are substitution possibilities. You have the capacity to look at 16 products, right? So this is something you can do. Very quickly, I won't have the time to go in explaining the graph in detail, but this is showing you the gas intensity, meaning kilowatt hours per euro. So the more gas you need per euro, the earlier your production becomes unviable. This is now in log scale because this is extremely skewed. And this graph shows you, for instance, here at the right tail of the solid line, that there are products that use 5 or 10 kilowatt hours per euro of sales, and you can easily compute the gas price that is needed to make this production unviable just because of the gas. But the good news from this graph, from a policymaker's perspective, is in the title of this slide. So the gas-heavy products are at the same time also more gas-intensive, right? So and the gas-intensive products are, of course, those products that will the earliest be or the easiest be replaced by imports, or that the market forces will kick in most quickly. So a Leontief example here below, eliminating, that's important, the 25% most gas-intensive products among the 300, not in the entire manufacturing sector, just the 25% among the 300 most gas-heavy products yields a 40% gas saving for the total manufacturing sector. That's due to the skewness of the distribution. And the direct loss at this stage of the value chain of about 11 billion, which is not much if you compare it to more than 4,000 billion of GDP. Now, quickly to the import data. So what we computed is the ratio of the domestic consumption of certain gas-intensive products or gas-heavy products to the global trade volume. That's the ratio we are interested in, because this is telling you, simply how easy it would likely be to substitute your gas-heavy products with imports, right? And the domestic consumption can be computed from this Comtrade data in combination with the manufacturing sector data by adding imports to your domestic production and subtracting exports. and divided by the global trade volume. So this is telling you or giving you a raw number of how important your domestic consumption is relative to what is traded. Of course, trade might react. There might be more goods traded if Germany's demand increases, but still, giving that data is only backward-looking by nature, this is maybe the best that you can do here. All right. Again, I will not go into detail. According to this, will not in detail explain this graph. This is now combining all the data sets. And it's basically showing you that the products with the highest degree of import substitutability, so that's the horizontal axis, are, and that's good news, at the same time, on average, more gas intensive. So they will very likely be imported. Right? So they are easily substitutable and they are very gas intensive, so they will be the first that downstream firms will import. Unfortunately, here, however, in our case, those products are not particularly gas heavy, so they are below average gas heavy. Again, an example. So if you or the market would eliminate the production of the products that are both above the median in the gas intensity and above the median in import substitutability, so exactly the part of the data where you would expect that private actors kind of would substitute, then you, just among the 300 products again, then it will save you 26% in gas consumption, again at a cost of around 11 billion only. And again, import substitution means that there are no downstream cascade effects here anymore, right? So downstream producers just import the ammonia that you otherwise would make out of gas from the US. That's the idea here. Okay, last slide. Potential policy advice. So the main story here is the same that Taka just made. Use the advantages of granular data, right? Look into granular data and identify, in our case, the most gas-heavy products. And this, as I mentioned before, will most likely be, if you are lucky, a small number of products. Something tractable from a policy perspective, from the perspective of a ministry. So you might have enough experts, or you can contact enough experts to really understand the production processes and the, whatever, in our case, chemical reactions that are behind kind of basic chemical processes. And then you can, first of all, look at, okay, how much value is added per unit of gas? That's what we have done. You can look at whether those products can be substituted. That's what I showed you. But you can also have a much better understanding about energy input substitution for those few products, right? You can really talk to experts. What would be the elasticity of substitution for those specific production processes? And they might be impossible for some processes. Here's the example of ammonia synthesis, because there gas is not the energy input. It's a raw material that you use that you didn't need. You need the hydrogen from the gas. And that might be very difficult for very heat-intensive processes like steel production or glass production, but maybe it's possible there. But it might be easier for others. And even if you have a situation where your product is gas-heavy, it may, but it cannot be imported, right? Then you could go down the value chain to the next step and see whether the products that are produced from the not substitutable product can be imported themselves, right? Then again, you would potentially safeguard the other stages of the value chain. So these are things you could plausibly do if it's just a few products, a low number of products. And of course, you could think about temporarily restricting any exports. Finally, if you have all this knowledge, you could start thinking about preparing an emergency plan that would not look like everyone is rationed by whatever, 25%. But you could come up with a plan that saves gas where costs are minimal. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mueller. Thank you very much for providing your interesting research on the gas intensity and import substitution. Okay, so now I would like to invite our discussant, Dr. Chad BOWN from Peterson Institute for International Economics, to provide comments. Dr. Chad BOWN is expert on trade restrictiveness measures and U.S. trade policies and also economic security issues. Okay, so Dr. BOWN, please go ahead.
Thank you. Like everyone, I want to congratulate and thank the organizers. RIETI-JOGMEC-IDE-JETRO, you are at the forefront of the economic security conversation around the world, and you really deserve to be congratulated for what it is that you're doing. A year ago at this time, I was not in my current job. I'm usually an aspiring nerd like these two. But last year at this time, the United States, we have a very strange system. I was actually in government. I was the chief economist at the State Department in the Biden administration. And my job was to absorb their research and to help work with partners and allies here in Tokyo, in Paris, in Berlin, in other countries to figure out how we could work on these issues together. And it was amazing, actually. I think Tokyo was my favorite experience. When I got here, I can't remember if it was Meti or Mofa or whom, asked me, they said, how did you ever get an office of the chief economist in the State Department? We want that here in Tokyo too. And I told them. And then they said, okay, how did you actually get economists in the office of the chief economist to talk about economic security? And so I didn't bother to tell them that there were only 4 of us in the office. But in any case, you're making tremendous progress and you're really leading the way, I think, in this new era. So congratulations and keep up your great work. Okay, my job as discussant is to do a couple of things. The first thing I wanted to do is to briefly summarize what it is that they're doing here and what they're contributing, these 2 papers, Steffen and Takafumi. And these are the best examples of what we have about using extremely detailed microeconomic level research to understand these supply chain vulnerabilities and to do something about them. There is nothing better than what these 2 have been putting together to contribute to this conversation, and they deserve a huge amount of congratulations for this. Now, the challenge is, ideally, we would have liked research about the Great East Japan earthquake, not 15 years after the earthquake, but in real time. And the same thing about German gas, not 4 years after the invasion, but in real time, right? So the other contribution of these authors is to explain their methodology, explain their data requirements, and to make the case to policymakers to build the capacity to analyze these things in real time, to both identify vulnerabilities, to build preparedness, and to be able to deal with crises as they erupt. So please take seriously both the work that they're doing and the implicit calls that they're making for policymakers to invest in the data necessary and the research capabilities necessary to be able to contribute insights into both the short-term and the long-term questions. So congratulations, read their papers when they're available, learn from them, and build it into your capacity-enhancing capabilities. Now, that being said, I have to critique them. So here are some of my critiques. And here's where I get really mean. Having been on the other side of this as a policymaker, reading about short or long run elasticities, blah, blah, blah. I don't know what that means. I need to know how much time. Is it 3 months? Is it 6 months? I've got to prioritize what my spending is. This is a problem that industry is going to resolve before I would ever get the money allocated to help them resolve it. So help me think about time more seriously, right? Find alternative suppliers. Helping firms deal with finding alternative suppliers. Yeah, but how, right? In some of my research, I've gone out and surveyed major multinationals, and I'm going to pick on BMW because so far they're the only one in the room that I can point to. But I think if BMW went to their suppliers and said, give us your supplier list, so tier 1 folks, give us your tier 2, tier 3, and we'll help you find, that they would say, no way are we giving you our supplier list. That's our secret sauce. If you had our supplier list, you would cut us out and you would go to our suppliers directly, right? These are the real world challenges that firms face. So economists, you all are now the experts on these supply chains, but you need to push your analysis further and think more carefully about the real world and helping policymakers understand the policy trade-offs and the institutional constraints that they face. Similarly, when it comes to thinking up the supply chain, when it comes to gas-intensive sectors, fantastic. So what are we suggesting then? Import subsidies for the chemical industry in Germany? Maybe. These are big multinationals. What are you thinking about? Is this just a short-term fix until the sort of upstream price pressures get resolved? Right? Let's be as specific and creative as possible. Policymakers, they're very busy. They don't have the details that you all have from having studied these things in great depth. So push yourselves. And again, those are not the kinds of questions that are going to get published in the American Economic Review, right? But write them up separately because they're extraordinarily valuable for policymakers. And in policy, I've got an hour. I'm going to chat GPT something to figure out who's the expert on this thing. If you've written something like that, then I will see it and I will call you to figure out what the answer is. But if I can't figure that out, if I've only seen you write some paper about long run and short run elasticities, I don't know if you actually know anything that's of value to me or not. And as a policymaker, I only have a very short amount of time. Okay. Right now, I am working on a book. Actually, it's due tomorrow. It's called How to Win a Trade War. So actually, if any of you have any ideas how to win a trade war, it's not too late. You can tell me. Alternatively, it would be called This New Era of Economic Security, What's Going On? So we've got 2 English publishers. We've got a publisher in Germany. We've got a translation in Korean. We've got Taiwan. But we don't have one in Japanese yet. So if anybody would like to publish the book, come up and see me afterward. But the point of this book is essentially to do the kind of things and to interpret this kind of research for a broader audience and to push the world to think harder about some of the details of policies, right? So, for example, and we heard some of this already this morning, we need creative thinking about stockpiling. So if we're going to suggest stockpiling, well, what does that mean? How do we actually implement stockpiling? When do we build up the stocks? How do we release the stocks? What are the rules that we should be following in this kind of space if we're thinking about stockpiling new things like critical minerals, rare earths, dealing with gallium shortages, or now we're all experts in permanent magnets that none of us knew anything about a year ago, all right? If we're thinking about subsidies, interventions in certain areas, how do we implement it? Is it a long-run thing where we can just kind of wait for tax credits for firms? No, it needs to be much more targeted. We need to have grants out there. Equity stakes in companies, price guarantees, right? As economists, we have a lot of insights if we're willing to think hard about the details of some of these supply chains and some of these vulnerabilities. And so we should be doing that kind of thing. So to conclude, again, a huge congratulations to this group for having convened this subject matter. You really are at the forefront of things. This topic is not going to go away. As much as the United States right now might have everybody thinking that tariffs are where all the action is, it's kind of, I mean, it's important, don't get me wrong, and I understand we all have to deal with it. But in a sense, it's kind of a distraction because this is the heart of what we all need to be worried about and focused on right now. So I'm really glad that you're separating out all of that noise and doing so. To do so, it does require this incredible academic, government, and private sector partnership, and all working together and figuring out how to share data to be able to do the kinds of analysis that we need to do. And so JOGMEC, RIETI, IDE-JETRO, again, and it's how to win a trade war. Chad Bown with Samaya Keynes. And you can order it, pre-order it right now on Amazon, actually, if you want to get the English version. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. BOWN. Very interesting, intriguing comments. And yeah, I should order your new book immediately after this session. Okay, so, well, we have one question from the floor, but while we are waiting for more questions from the floor, I'd like to ask two presenters to respond to Dr. BOWN's comments. He discussed about the real world challenges, and he said how much time does it take to make adjustments on supply chains and so on. So could you respond to Dr. BOWN's comments? First, Dr. Kawakubo, and then second, yeah.
She asked everybody first. Would you like to be second? No.
Would you like to go first?
No, you are first.
Okay, just a couple of minutes for each. Thank you.
Yeah, so thank you very much for making comments and suggestions. I think, yeah, I totally understand that there are some difficulties. Researchers try to do academic work published on top journals, but actually sometimes it's not fit the real world needs. So I think together with Professor Fukao recently, we were working on, for example, Japanese custom data. But for example, we can use the data up to 2023, but not recent ones. So, for example, it would be really nice if the center actually pull the data up to now, so that we can conduct real-time analysis on the real-time events like the tariffs, export controls, and so on. And then we would have more capacity or capability to speak to real-time kind of questions. So that's one thing. And at the same time, I think it would be great if we could have big capacity in the center with some sort of large number of researchers helping us with conducting policy analysis along with the academic research. So I think for researchers to be involved, top-level researchers to be involved in this kind of center, I think it's necessary for the government to allow the researchers to publish papers, academic findings, and academic journals out of the center. But I think combining the capability that researchers hold, or the knowledge that industry hold, also the policy knowledge at the ministries, I think we can push the frontier forward. I think we are very much exciting to have this conversation today and push the frontier forward.
Okay, then it's my turn. Thank you, Chad, for these nice thoughts. I think having been on the other side makes you the perfect discussant for this session. And you mentioned kind of a list from the toolbox of policymakers, like subsidies, interventions, equity stakes, and so forth. And this makes me think of kind of, are we moving partly to something like a more centrally planned economy and not a free market economy? So this sounds a little bit like this. And I would like to make the case for not going that way too far. So I was born in a centrally planned economy in East Germany, and I saw how 40 years of this can ruin one of the most prospering regions from the German Empire, right, up until now. So I think firms, or private firms, are ultimately responsible for safeguarding their value chains. And if BMW has fears that their suppliers might be too small to secure their value chains, then please take care. I mean, you could also insource them, right? Then it would be your problem. So I think asking for government help immediately is a bit too easy. And if you think about even organizing critical supplies for your firms, then you would create a lot of wrong incentives for your economy. You would depress innovation. You would depress all the flexibility and creativity that Taka was kind of mentioning. So firms find their way. They are much more flexible than we all think from our 2-digit sector level analysis. I think this is the main point from this micro level analysis here. So there are a lot of substitution possibilities that you are all not aware of, or many of us are not aware of, because we don't know the details of each sector, of each industrial process. We just don't know. So on the other hand, if you have a government that kind of organizes critical inputs for firms, then you have other problems, right? This makes a government very powerful. Would you like to have that? Would you like to raise the risk of corruption and these type of things? I'm not sure. So I think the role that we have here is maybe to really monitor those things, to really understand processes, to be able to assess risks, and as a government maybe decide on which infrastructure project to support and which not. Really understand how important are those risks for policy making, for politics, as in the Russian gas thing. That's, I guess, the task that maybe also RIETI might assume, really being in a position to understand things, but not to organize stuff for the private sector economy. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much. We have one question to Professor Mueller. So could you answer to the question from the floor? The question is, if you substitute energy imports by imports of energy-consuming products, isn't it possible that those products were produced using Russian gas? So could you answer to this question?
Yeah, that's a good one. And in this case, it's actually easily answered because, I mean, if you import ammonia from the US, you can be quite sure it's not produced from Russian gas. Thank you.
So is it okay, no problem?
I mean, that's in this case, it's very easy, right? I mean, it might be more difficult if you have rare materials that maybe other countries also source from risky source countries. In our case, where it's about kind of a gas shortage, and you think about importing urea or ammonia, you might want to do this imported from the US, and then you can be sure that this product was not produced with Russian gas. That's what I meant with excluding, in this one slide, excluding Russia, of course, from this measure, excluding other European countries that also may have a gas shortage, right? I think you can do a lot to kind of get closer at this. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. So we are almost running out of time. So, okay, well, thank you very much for very active discussions and presentations. So on behalf of the organizers, I'd like to thank all the speakers and discussants for their excellent contribution to the session. Please join me in thanking our speakers. Thank you.